Okay, hi everybody. I am trying something that I haven't done much in a while, but thought maybe it'd be good to make some more content that's a little bit easier to make by kind of vaulting off of other articles, videos, etc. So I'm going to see about that. Anyway, today, what I've got for you is I read an article over at Mises by Bill Anderson called "Yes, Heather Cox Richardson is Economically Illiterate and Proud of It." And I figured this would be a little fun to talk about for a bit. So the obvious question, of course, is to ask, how illiterate is she? And the level of illiteracy that she has is that she mistakes the Great Depression and World War II for the best times ever economically because economic inequality went down. It's a pretty... When that's your only criterion, you can do a lot of really bad things and still end up better off in the equality sense. So this article by Bill Anderson kind of, laments the proliferation of the idea that income and wealth inequality is like the problem. If we just got to fix this and that would solve everything, as if people wouldn't find other things to be envious of each other about if they had the same amount of cash. He goes into discussing how, there's all of their weird arguments, and the point that I want to kind of emphasize or add to it maybe a little bit is that the promoters of income and wealth inequality the promoters of income and wealth equality face basically two big problems. Number one, the innate absurdity of their position. So there's this old example that I think Rothbard came up with, where imagine that you had everybody in the world, or everybody in the society, whatever, had the same amount of cash. They had the same amount of wealth, right? And then, let's say that Wilt Chamberlain and a couple other guys decide that they're going to play a game of basketball, and they ask everybody who wants to watch the game of basketball to pay them a quarter. Well, everybody has $100, right? Something like that to start with. And they all pay 25 cents to Wilt Chamberlain and some of his friends, and they play a game of basketball. Now, Wilt Chamberlain and his friends get very rich off of doing this because, a billion people each pay a quarter of a dollar. Well, that's still a pretty sizable chunk of cash. And now, all of a sudden, Wilt Chamberlain and his friends are, richer than everybody else. It is obvious here that Wilt Chamberlain hasn't stolen anything from anyone, that he hasn't made anyone worse off. Everybody gave that quarter voluntarily, and so they think that they're better off with the enjoyment of having watched the basketball game as opposed to, not having watched the basketball game. And this gets to the one of the big basic problems with, thinking about inequality as being a problem in and of itself. This example can be extended easily to any kind of increased production. Like, for instance, imagine back in the day everybody was making flatbread or something like that, and someone comes up with the way to make sourdough bread. And he says, oh, with the same amount of flour, I can make bread that people are willing to pay more for because it tastes better and it's fluffier and yada, yada, yada. This guy has created value, and this applies to almost any kind of innovation or any kind of entrepreneurship, that if you can gain by coming up with ideas and implementing them, because it's not just having an idea, right? There's always some risk involved, because it might be that everybody hates sourdough bread, and so he, spends a bunch of money working on this sourdough bread setup and discovers that he can't sell it nearly as well. So there's an entrepreneurial aspect too, where you have to say, this thing I'm changing, is it going to be better or worse for the consumer? This is the basic insight that Mises had, that actually the people who control all these big corporations, so to speak, are the consumers themselves, as long as the government isn't picking winners and losers. Because it's the people that have to end up buying these products, and if they don't like them, then they won't buy them. If they don't believe that they're going to get value from them, then they won't voluntarily subscribe or purchase or whatever. In fact, this idea that we have to keep things equal has major negative effects on all of entrepreneurship and therefore a lot of the forces that drive economic growth. And then we have the government standing up as an example of making things equal, when the way that it makes things equal is by actually stealing things by taking people's pay, their land, etc., for some dubious public purpose. Or, as they are wont to do these days, they just fail to actually punish actual thieves, which, is something that ostensibly they're supposed to do, solve crimes and, fix that. But they don't do that either. And the number two problem of that promoters of equality face is that this position has an intensely huge amount of utility for big government and bigger government. As I illustrated in the Wilt Chamberlain example, in order to maintain equality, you need to have some kind of person there to constantly meddle with things. And that person has to make a bunch of value judgments, right? If I have $100 and a car, and somebody else has $100 and a football, well, they'll say, well, the football's worth less than the car, so obviously we need to move some money around and stuff. There are subtler examples. If I have $100 in an apple and you have $100 in an orange, now the government gets to say, well, you're going to have to, give him 50 cents because that's the price difference between an apple and an orange, kind of thing like that. It gives government this constant excuse to poke at you and measure you and say, oh, you made this much. Oh, you did this. Oh, you did this. And you have to report all this stuff. It's the only way that it can be enforced. So, you get a lot of surveillance stuff as well. And the question is really on some level, do you actually want to maintain equality if it causes a lot of losses? Imagining trying to maintain equality between Isaac Industrialist and Cecil Coke Addict, right? You have one guy who is actually takes the stuff that he has and builds it into bigger things. And then you have one guy who, whenever you give him anything above what he needs to eat and drink to survive, it immediately goes up his nose. Well, what you're going to do is you're going to start taking value away from the people who produce value and giving value to someone who blows things up, effectively speaking. The government does this too, right? They can take a bunch of taxes and build a boat and then sink it. And that's value added according to GDP. You can literally drain a society dry like this. You can take so much from the people that are producing that there's not enough left for everybody to have stuff, and you literally just burn through your whole stock of capital. Socialists believe that what they call the problem of production has been solved, and that all that's left is to figure out how to distribute what's actually been produced. But this assumes that the state owns everything by virtue of its ability to shake people down. It's also wrong as Marx's idea that factory management is just basic arithmetic. It's more complicated than that. Of course, constant shakedowns can cut production surprisingly fast. Sometimes they can get away with it if they're subtle about it, but there are times that we've seen in history where these shakedowns have immediate negative effects on the way that people live. I mean, it only took a few years for Stalin to take Ukraine and turn it from a breadbasket into a famine. All he did at first was to take farmland from those who had more, that is to say, had earned more by knowing how to farm, and give it to those who didn't. Later enforcement, the part that actually caused the most of the deaths of the famine was from a reaction where he was basically putting his fist down because productivity had dropped. Well, no surprise, productivity fell. You just took everything, you took all the farm equipment away from the people who knew how to use it and gave it to people who didn't know how to use it. No surprise. But of course, it made things worse. And that's really all you can do. You just tighten your fist and then, the grains of wheat kind of fall away. There's a book by Robert Conquest called Harvest of Sorrow. Actually, hold on a second here. There's a book called Conquest of Sorrow, Harvest of Sorrow by Robert Conquest. And in the earlier chapters of this book, you get basically a whole chapter that's about all the bickering that went on with the definition of what a kulak was and who was to be expropriated, from the point where a kulak was a guy who rented land to somebody else for them to till, all the way to the point where the kulak was a guy who had the extra dough to purchase and maintain a goat, right? And when, the definition of kulak gets dropped down from it happens naturally. The definition, you expropriate from the richest, and then, well, you have a new richest group to expropriate from, and you just keep shaving off the top until all the high poppies are gone. You end up with a population that's so impoverished that nobody can even own a goat. And then, one of the things that Bill Anderson talks about is this idea of the Great Compression. Now, this is a period where... Now, to be fair, Heather Cox Richardson describes the Great Compression as going from 1933 to 1981. And so it foggies things up a little bit more because there's a lot more stuff in there. But, and you're going to love this, Paul Krugman has an article where he says that the Great Compression spans from 1929 to 1947. And the idea, of course, that these equality nuts have is that the Great Compression was these great times because because inequality went down, and what they fail to mention is that actual value that people were getting went way down as well, because the Great Compression was the Great Depression plus World War II. We have mass poverty. We have mass joblessness. We have civil unrest. We have a command economy. We have rationing. We have the murdering of millions of people. We have the destruction of huge amounts of actual capital that could have been used for good things turned into tanks and ships that are, exploded husks on some wasteland somewhere, or hunks of iron at the bottom of the sea. What Richardson is doing by extending it to 1981 is muddling things even more by basically adding in a bunch of unrelated things, and kind of saying, "Oh yeah, now this is it," and that makes my case better. When the more complicated something is, generally speaking, the more subtle your analysis of it has to be, and she does exactly the opposite. It's worth noting that gross domestic product, GDP, kind of has a problem because government spending is put in there without really asking what that spending did. Now, there are people who are like, well, the government can't produce anything. That's not entirely true, because the government can take over processes that would be provided in a free market, like the provision of security, and they can provide it. They provide it less efficiently and more expensively and more poorly because of a bunch of bad incentives that taking tax money to fund this thing does. But, it's not true that they necessarily destroy everything they get their hands on, but they can. And in fact, incentive-wise, they're encouraged to do so more so than private owners of those, resources. I actually wrote a thing that went up at Mises a while back about this, where there's 4 strong reasons why you can expect that any money given to the government is going to do less good than that same money in private hands going through voluntary transactions. But, as I said earlier, the point is that, if you're going to add government spending, G, to GDP, where G in GDP is gross, but then GDP equals G plus blah, 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 and the G is government spending, right? Well, why do we include G, government spending, as GDP when all you did was build a thing and blow it up? That doesn't make any sense. But you can certainly fudge the numbers that way. You can certainly mess with the numbers that way by making something, overvaluing it, and then destroying it. All of these things require people to be paid. And even putting away the World War II example, we can even look at the Great Depression, where the government was buying large quantities of hogs and then cremating them, so that they didn't go onto the market. Well, yeah, those hogs could have fed people if they had been allowed to go onto the market, but the government, in an attempt to kind of subsidize hog farmers, decided to take those hogs off the market to keep the price of pork higher. This, of course, is not a productive thing. It is a destructive thing. And it's important to make the differentiation between these two, which Richardson does not. And then at the very end of the article, Bill Anderson is talking about This is not to say there are no harmful wealth transfers occurring from lower income to the so-called 1%. By creating asset bubbles that inflate the assets held by the wealthiest people in our country through inflation, the Federal Reserve System has been running a wealth distribution scheme that really does harm to the economy and to those who are in lower income groups. And then he quotes Russell Lamberti about this. But I actually thought about extending this a little bit, because he talks about like the inflationary boom part. But there's also the expropriationary taxation part. It's a 1-2 punch that destroys productivity while giving the impression to government statisticians that things are going well. Number one, tax the rich and then waste those proceeds on a growing bureaucracy. What this does is it discourages producers from producing, and it also obligates the future government to pay these new bureaucrats, because one thing the government hates to do is fire bureaucrats. It's like, yay, we reduced inequality by discouraging people from making surpluses. Well, that's not the way to do that. If you're going to improve equality, if you're going to reduce inequality, the way you would do that is by helping the people who are not making surpluses to make surpluses, not to get a bunch of people who are making surpluses and destroy their surpluses. That's a bad thing to do. I think everybody can realize why that's a bad thing to do. Or, alternatively, you can say, look, employment is up. Unemployment is way down. We've got 100,000 new bureaucrats that are shuffling papers back and forth about which piece of steel they're going to sink to the bottom of the ocean tomorrow. It doesn't actually produce anything, and all it does is make things harder for people who want to produce things. And then number 2 is the asset bubble that Bill Anderson was talking about. What you do is you blow up an asset bubble, and you hand a bunch of new money to big businesses, but not just any big business. You hand it to the big businesses who are going to promote government narratives in some way or another. You pull purchasing power away from the poor, and from government, and from businesses that aren't so friendly toward the government, and you give them to this other group, which, if the people who are, there's plenty of people in government and, just in investing who are very willing to capitalize on this kind of opportunity. But what ends up happening is you basically destroy surpluses with the heavy taxation, and then you move whatever's left in the direction that you want as government by doing these asset bubbles. It's like, wow, look at the stock market, look at the housing market. I'm sure that those interest-only mortgages are going to be just fine. That 1-2 punch, it's tax and then inflate, and then tax and then inflate. You create this cycle by which the government just makes itself bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And, if it does this fast enough, it actually can consume any surplus that's created by innovation or entrepreneurship. Every bureaucrat that gets hired is not producing anything now, but he's consuming part of that surplus that was left over. This can, this actually can outpace the people that are producing more and more. And that's, of course, the breakaway point, the point where things get really bad, because once it does, things get bad really fast. The government says, oh, things are getting worse, we need to clamp down even more, and the clampdown hurts things even more to the point where you end up like Ukraine in the 1930s. What's the solution? Well, the solution from Mises would be to shrink the state, to reduce its economic meddling to laissez-faire, to get rid of the welfare state and to go back to private charity and organizations like that. We can go even further, though. We can look at Rothbard and Hoppe. What they would say is we need to decentralize. We need to get rid of the coercive parts of the state either by voluntarizing them, by privatizing them, or eliminating them altogether. That would certainly be better than constantly, striking off the excess that people make and then blowing up a bubble to give that excess to people who don't deserve it, which is what government does, and what people like Heather Cox Richardson and Paul Krugman are very, 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 very intent on hiding from you. So I will put a link to this article in the description. I hope you will go take a look at it. It is a fun little read. Bill Anderson's usually pretty fun to read. He has some good perspectives on things, and he's a good mixture of the fun and the wonkish. So good, worth reading. Anyway, I hope I added something to this. I hope you go look at the article. I hope I hope this was fun, and yeah, have a good weekend, and I will see you next time.